The stillness of the prairie was shattered by the unmistakable sound of hooves thundering across the dry earth. Martha Callahan knew in an instant something was wrong. Her horses never ran like that unless they were being driven hard. Her heart pounded, her breath caught in her chest. With a practiced motion, she set down the water jug and reached for the Winchester 1873 hanging on the wall. Ever since she buried her husband, she had known this day would come, the day someone tested her. She stepped out onto the porch, and for a moment, the blinding sun forced her to squint. But when her vision adjusted, rage tightened in her gut. 3 men sat atop her horses, laughing amongst themselves, as if they had earned the right. The stable doors swung open behind them, creaking in the wind, the dust on the ground still swirling from the disturbance. They had moved fast. Too fast. These men were no common drifters. They were professionals, and they had chosen the wrong ranch to rob. Martha took another step forward, the wooden planks of the porch groaning beneath her weight. The men noticed her then, their easy laughter fading. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard and cruel eyes, smirked as he turned his horse to face her. "Well, well, what do we have here?" His voice was thick with condescension. The other 2 chuckled, but one kept his hand a little too close to his holster. A cautious man, one who understood when danger was staring him in the face. She didn't answer. Her icy blue gaze locked onto the leader's face, steady and unblinking. She could feel the weight of the rifle in her hands, the worn wood familiar against her fingers. They weren't just stealing livestock. They were taking what little she had left. The years had already stripped her of so much: her husband, her youth, her peaceful life. But not her resolve. No, that was still as strong as iron. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "Listen, lady. Ain't no need to get yourself all riled up. Go on inside, pour yourself a cup of tea. These horses? They ain't yours no more." He grinned, his teeth yellowed from years of whiskey and bad choices. He barely finished speaking before the gunshot rang out. Boom. His hat exploded off his head, the bullet missing his scalp by a whisper. The laughter stopped. His men tensed, the weight of the moment sinking in. Martha lowered the barrel slowly, her grip still steady. Her voice was calm, cold, and final. "You have exactly 5 seconds to drop those reins and get the hell off my land." For the first time, fear flickered in the leader's eyes. The prairie wind carried only silence. They had made a grave mistake. They had messed with the wrong woman. Who were these men, really? What grudge did they hold against Martha? And most importantly, what would she do next to prepare for their inevitable return? The 3 men didn't move at first. The leader, still reeling from the bullet that had torn his hat clean off, sat frozen in his saddle, his jaw clenched so tightly Martha could almost hear his teeth grinding. His fingers hovered near the grip of his revolver, twitching slightly as if debating whether or not he should draw. His men, younger and clearly less sure of themselves, looked at him for direction, but he didn't speak. Not right away. He was weighing his options, considering the kind of woman who stood before him, and perhaps, for the first time in a long while, realizing he had made a mistake. Martha Callahan didn't waver. The Winchester remained steady in her hands, her grip firm, her stance unwavering. She had spent years by John Callahan's side, watching him stare down outlaws and killers without so much as a blink. He had always said that winning a fight often had little to do with bullets, it was about who broke first. And Martha could see it now, right in the leader's dark, narrowed eyes. He was trying to convince himself that he could kill her and walk away, but something in her demeanor told him otherwise. He didn't know her, but he knew what she was capable of. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply through his nose, like a bull resigning itself to a fight for another day. "Let's go," he muttered, yanking on the reins. His horse reared slightly before turning away. His men hesitated a second longer, glancing back at Martha, at the gun still raised, before reluctantly following. They rode off without another word, their figures gradually disappearing into the heat waves rolling off the dry earth. Martha stood motionless, eyes locked on the trail of dust they left behind. She kept her rifle up for a few more seconds, just in case, before finally lowering it, exhaling a slow, measured breath. But she didn't feel relieved. She had seen the way the leader looked at her in those final moments. He might have left, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She turned on her heel and walked toward the stable, boots scuffing against the packed dirt. The air was thick with the scent of hay and sweat, and inside, the horses were still restless, their eyes wide, ears flicking in agitation. She ran a steadying hand along Dolly's neck, feeling the tension in the mare's muscles. "Easy, girl," she murmured. I know. Because Martha did know. She knew men like that, prideful, violent, the kind who didn't take well to being bested, especially by a woman. This wasn't just about the horses anymore. This was about respect, about dominance. And men like that? They always came back. Martha took a slow breath, eyes drifting to the horizon where the dust had long since settled. Next time, she wouldn't just be waiting. Next time, she'd be ready. Who was their leader, and why did he look at her like he had seen her before? What unfinished business did they have with her? And just how far was Martha willing to go when the time came to face them again? Martha didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, her rifle across her lap, eyes fixed on the dirt road leading to her ranch. The thieves were gone, but their presence lingered like the scent of gunpowder after a shot. She could still hear their leader's voice, the way he had hesitated before riding off. There was something familiar about him, something she couldn't shake. That man had known her name. That meant he wasn't just some wandering outlaw looking for easy prey. He had come to her land for a reason. As the first light of dawn stretched across the Wyoming plains, Martha rose from her chair, her joints stiff but her resolve firm. She had lived through enough to know that when trouble finds you once, it will find you again. The only question was when. By mid-morning, she was saddling Dolly. The mare had calmed since the previous day, but there was still a tension in her muscles, as if she too was waiting for something. Martha secured her rifle in its saddle holster and swung herself up, feeling the familiar creak of old leather beneath her. There was only one place to go for answers: Harper's Junction, a small town about an hour's ride south. If anyone knew who those men were, it would be the folks at Boyd's Saloon. The town came into view just before noon, a cluster of wooden buildings baking under the relentless sun. Martha guided Dolly toward the saloon, her boots hitting the ground with purpose as she dismounted. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of conversation. A few heads turned as she entered, some in recognition, others in curiosity. Martha Callahan didn't come to town often, and when she did, it was never for anything good. She made her way to the bar, where Cal Boyd, the owner, was polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days. He was a thick-set man with a permanent scowl and a sharp eye for trouble. He glanced up as she approached, setting the glass down with a dull thud. "Martha," he greeted, his voice a low rumble. "Ain't seen you in a while. What brings you in?" She didn't waste time. "3 men came to my ranch yesterday. Tried to take my horses. Their leader knew my name." Cal's expression didn't change, but Martha saw the way his fingers tightened slightly around the glass. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Damn fool men," he muttered. "You get a name?" Martha thought for a second. The man hadn't introduced himself, but something in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it tickled at the edges of her memory, just out of reach. Then she remembered. A name she hadn't thought about in years. Elias Mercer. The room went silent. A few men at nearby tables stopped mid-drink, eyes darting toward her. Even Cal, who had seen his fair share of trouble, looked uneasy. He let out a slow breath, setting his rag aside. "You sure about that?" Martha nodded. Cal let out a low whistle. "Well, hell. If Mercer's back in Wyoming, you got yourself a problem, Martha." Her stomach tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it real. Elias Mercer. A name that should have stayed buried. Who is Elias Mercer? What past does he share with Martha? And why, after all these years, has he come back looking for her? The name Elias Mercer hung in the air like a death sentence. The saloon, once alive with murmurs and laughter, had gone eerily quiet. Even the men who didn't know the name could feel the weight it carried. Martha felt it too, a name from a past she had buried, now clawing its way back to the surface. Cal Boyd ran a hand down his weathered face, sighing. "I thought Mercer was dead." Martha wished he was. She hadn't heard that name in over 20 years, not since the days when she rode alongside John Callahan, her husband and the only sheriff tough enough to bring law to the untamed corners of Wyoming. Mercer had been a ruthless outlaw, a man who thrived on chaos, feared from Montana to Texas. And for a time, he had been unstoppable, until John put a bullet in his gut and left him bleeding in the dust. They never found the body, but they assumed the desert had done the rest. Clearly, they had been wrong. Martha's fingers curled into a fist on the bar top. If Mercer was alive, he wasn't just passing through. He was here for a reason. Cal exhaled sharply, glancing around to make sure no one was listening too closely. "I heard some rumblings last month. Word is, Mercer's been running with a new gang. Mean sons of bitches. They've hit 3 ranches already, taking what they want and leaving nothing but wreckage behind." His voice lowered. "If he came for you, Martha, it ain't just about the horses." She already knew that. Men like Mercer didn't steal, they took. And if he had come to her ranch, it was because he wanted more than just livestock. He wanted vengeance. Martha straightened, her jaw set. She wasn't about to wait for Mercer to make the next move. "I need to know where he's holed up," she said. Cal shook his head. "You're playing with fire." She met his gaze, steel in her eyes. "Then I guess it's time to get burned." Cal studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. He reached behind the bar and pulled out a small, folded map, sliding it across the wood. "Word is, Mercer's men have been seen near the old mining camp in Devil's Hollow. It's about a 2-day ride from here." Martha took the map without a word, tucking it into her coat. As she turned to leave, Cal's voice stopped her. "John woulda told you not to go after him alone." Martha hesitated at the door, gripping the worn wood frame. "John ain't here." And with that, she walked out, the heavy weight of the past pressing against her shoulders. Elias Mercer had cheated death once. She wasn't going to let him do it again. What happened between Elias Mercer and John Callahan all those years ago? Why did Mercer come back now? And just how far is Martha willing to go to finish what should have ended long ago? The road to Devil's Hollow was long and merciless, stretching across the barren Wyoming landscape like a scar. Martha rode in silence, the steady rhythm of Dolly's hooves the only sound against the wind. The past had a way of creeping up when you least expected it, and now it was riding alongside her, whispering in her ear, reminding her of the last time she had faced Elias Mercer. She could still see it, the dust-filled afternoon when John Callahan tracked Mercer and his gang to a run-down hideout near the Colorado border. 6 men went in. Only 2 walked out. Mercer had been a different kind of outlaw. He didn't just rob banks or rustle cattle. He broke people, left families in ruins, burned down entire homesteads just to send a message. John had spent years chasing him, always one step behind, until that day. The fight had been brutal, bullets tearing through the wooden walls, bodies dropping one by one. Martha had been there, rifle in hand, covering John's flank. She had seen Mercer take the bullet to the gut, seen him collapse in the dirt, choking on his own blood. But somehow, the bastard had survived. And now he was back. Martha gritted her teeth. John had died thinking the job was done. She wasn't about to let that be a lie. By the time she reached the outskirts of Devil's Hollow, the sun was sinking behind the jagged cliffs, casting long shadows over the abandoned mining camp. It had been deserted for years, nothing left but collapsed buildings and rusting equipment. But something felt off. She slowed Dolly to a stop, scanning the area. Then she saw it, a faint flicker of firelight inside one of the old shacks. Martha slid off her horse, moving carefully, keeping low as she approached the structure. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, and as she got closer, she could hear voices inside. Rough, low murmurs, the kind of talk men had when they thought no one was listening. Then she heard a name. Her name. Her pulse quickened. Mercer was inside. She pressed her back against the wooden wall, steadying her breath. She had come here for answers, but now, standing inches away from the man who should have been dead, she realized something else. She had come here for vengeance. Will Martha go in guns blazing, or will she wait for the right moment to strike? What unfinished business does Elias Mercer have with her? And more importantly, is she walking into a trap? The night air was thick with the scent of burning wood and unwashed bodies. Martha pressed her back against the rotting wall of the shack, her breath slow and steady, her rifle held tight against her chest. She could hear them inside, Mercer's men, laughing, drinking, talking like they didn't have a care in the world. But there was something else in their voices, something dark. They weren't just celebrating a robbery. They were waiting for something. Then, she heard her name again. Martha edged closer to a gap in the wooden planks, just wide enough to see inside. For men sat around a fire, their faces flickering in the dim glow. One of them, a lanky bastard with a long scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt and smirked. "Boss says she ain't like other women," he muttered. "Says she's got fight in her." Another man, younger, built like an ox, chuckled as he took a swig from his flask. "Then why don't we just kill her and be done with it?" The scarred man shot him a look. "Because Mercer wants her alive." Martha's grip on the rifle tightened. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. A shadow moved across the firelight, and then he stepped forward. Elias Mercer. Time hadn't been kind to him, but it also hadn't killed him the way it should have. He was leaner now, his face more hollow, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. But his eyes, those damn eyes, were the same. Cold, calculating, hungry. He poured himself a drink, the bottle glinting in the firelight, and took a slow sip before speaking. "I waited 20 years for this." His voice was lower than she remembered, rough like gravel. "John Callahan thought he could bury me, but he was wrong. Just like he was wrong about a lot of things." The room fell silent. Even his men were waiting for him to say more. Mercer smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You boys don't know, do you?" He looked around at them, savoring the moment. Then he leaned forward, his grin widening. "She ain't just Callahan's widow. She's the one who put the bullet in me." The men murmured in surprise, exchanging glances. Martha's chest tightened. She had fired that shot all those years ago, aiming to finish what John had started. And now Mercer wanted her to pay for it. "She took everything from me," Mercer continued, his voice dark with something almost like amusement. "Now, I plan to return the favor." Martha had heard enough. She took a step back, her mind already racing. Mercer wasn't just looking for revenge. He wanted to break her, the way he had broken so many others. But he had made a mistake. He thought he was the hunter. He didn't realize she was hunting him. She took one last look at the firelit room, then disappeared into the darkness. It was time to end this. Martha now knows Mercer's plan, but does she have enough time to strike before he comes for her? Will she take the fight to him, or will she prepare for his arrival? And what secrets from the past still remain buried between them? Martha moved through the darkness like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the dry earth. The weight of her rifle was familiar in her hands, steady as her breath. She had spent the last 20 years trying to leave violence behind, but violence had found her again. And this time, she wouldn't wait for it to come knocking on her door. She reached Dolly, waiting patiently in the shadows near a thicket of dead brush. Stroking the mare's neck, Martha took one last look at the flickering firelight in the shack, at the silhouettes of Mercer and his men laughing, drinking, believing they had the upper hand. Let them. She mounted up, guiding Dolly away from Devil's Hollow, heading back toward her ranch. She needed to think. A head-on fight was suicide. Mercer had at least 4 men with him, maybe more. And if she knew anything about him, he wouldn't come for her in broad daylight. No, he'd wait for the dead of night, when fear crawled into a person's bones. Good. Let him try. By the time she reached her ranch, the sky was bleeding into the first light of dawn. The land around her was silent, untouched, but Martha could feel the storm coming. She swung off Dolly and moved quickly, setting things in motion. First, she checked her supplies. Ammunition. Enough. Lantern oil. Enough. Whiskey. Not for drinking. She grabbed her old hunting knife from a drawer, running her thumb over the worn leather grip. John had given it to her on their wedding day. Said every woman ought to have something sharp at her side. He wasn't wrong. She reinforced the barn doors, tightened the locks on the house, but left the corral gate wide open. A welcome sign. Let them think she was careless. Let them come strolling in like wolves sniffing at easy prey. By midday, she was ready. Now, all that was left to do was wait. And when night fell over the Wyoming plains, Martha Callahan was wide awake, her rifle loaded, her knife sharp, and her heart as cold as the steel in her hands. They were coming, and she was ready. Mercer and his men are on their way. Will Martha's plan be enough to outmatch them? Or will she have to become something even deadlier to survive the night? The wind howled through the empty plains, rattling the wooden beams of the ranch house. The oil lamp on Martha's table flickered weakly, casting long, restless shadows across the walls. She sat in her chair, rifle resting across her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. They were coming. She had spent the entire day preparing, setting the pieces in place, waiting for the inevitable. Now, the air was thick with the kind of silence that always came before a storm. Then, she heard it. The snap of a branch. Martha didn't move. Didn't breathe. She knew better than to react too soon. Instead, she closed her fingers around the grip of her rifle, her pulse steady. Through the thin curtain, she could see shadows moving along the fence line. Slow. Careful. Predators circling their kill. 4 men. Mercer's men. But no Mercer. A cold chill crept up Martha's spine. Where the hell was he? One of the men, the broad-shouldered brute she had seen in the shack, gestured toward the barn. 2 others split off, rifles in hand, moving like they had done this 100 times before. They thought she was sleeping. They thought she'd be easy. Let them think. Martha waited until one of them reached for the barn door. Then she pulled the trigger. The shot exploded into the night, and the man dropped like a stone, his body twisting into the dirt before he even had the chance to cry out. The others reacted instantly. Gunfire erupted, bullets slamming into the side of the house, splintering wood. Martha dropped to the floor, rolling to the side as glass from the window shattered above her head. They had expected a woman asleep in her bed. They weren't expecting a fight. Martha crawled to the other window, breath steady, movements practiced. The second man, the one with the scar, was crouched near the fence, trying to reload. She took aim. Another shot. Another body hitting the dust. The broad-shouldered one was screaming now, cursing, firing wildly in her direction. She could hear the younger one, the kid, panicking, his voice high with fear. "She's picking us off. She's—" Boom. A lantern in the barn erupted in flames, engulfing the dry hay in an instant. The fire spread fast, casting the entire ranch in a flickering, violent glow. Martha didn't look at it. Her mind was sharp, focused on only one thing. Where the hell was Mercer? And then, behind her, through the chaos of gunfire and fire, she heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard inside the house. She wasn't alone. Mercer was already inside. Martha has taken out Mercer's men, but now the real fight begins. Elias Mercer is inside the house, and in the flickering firelight, it's just the two of them. Widow versus outlaw. Only one of them is walking away. The house was deathly silent. Martha stood frozen, rifle still aimed at the last man outside, but her mind had already shifted. Mercer was inside. The creak of the floorboard had been soft, too soft for a man his size. He was moving carefully, deliberately, like a snake slithering through the dark. Slowly, she stepped back from the window, shifting her grip on the rifle. The air felt heavier now, thick with smoke, sweat, and something far more dangerous, Mercer's presence. Then, his voice cut through the quiet. "Hell of a shot, Martha." She turned sharply, rifle raised toward the voice, but the dim light played tricks on the shadows. He wasn't in front of her. He was somewhere deeper inside the house. "You should have stayed dead," she said coldly. A low chuckle echoed from the darkness. "Oh, I did, sweetheart. For a long time. And you put me there, didn't you?" His voice was steady, smooth, filled with something that wasn't quite anger, something worse. Satisfaction. Martha's grip on the rifle tightened. She wouldn't let him toy with her. She moved slowly through the main room, boots careful on the wooden floor, eyes scanning every shadow. Her heart pounded, but her breathing stayed controlled. She had hunted men before. She knew the game. "You want revenge, Mercer?" she called out, keeping her voice calm, measured. "Come and take it." Silence. Then, a crash. A shadow lunged from the corner. Martha spun just in time to see Mercer coming at her, his long coat flaring as he swung a knife. She barely managed to step back, the blade slicing through the air where her throat had been seconds ago. She fired, too close, too fast. The bullet grazed his side, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Before she could take another shot, he slammed into her. The force sent her crashing into the table, knocking over the oil lamp. Glass shattered. Fire licked across the floorboards, flickering between them. Martha hit the ground hard, her rifle skidding across the room. Pain shot up her back, but she gritted her teeth and reached for the knife strapped to her boot. Mercer stood over her now, a slow grin spreading across his face. He was bleeding, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes glowed in the firelight, sharp and hungry. "I waited a long time for this," he muttered, twisting the knife in his hand. "I want to see the fear in your eyes when I take everything from you." Martha exhaled slowly, gripping her knife tight. Then she smiled. Mercer frowned. And in that split second of hesitation, Martha struck. With a sharp, brutal movement, she drove her blade upward, straight into his side. Mercer let out a choked gasp, staggering back. Blood spilled between his fingers as he clutched the wound, eyes wide in shock. Martha pushed herself up, breathing hard. The fire was growing now, spreading fast. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, turning the air thick and hot. Mercer coughed, stepping back toward the door, his face twisted in pain, but not fear. Even now, with blood pouring from his body, he was still smiling. "This ain't over," he rasped. Then, in a final burst of movement, he turned and fled into the night. Martha staggered forward, her knife still dripping red. She could chase him, end it right now. But behind her, the flames roared to life. The house, the home she had built with John, was burning. She had a choice to make. Does Martha chase Mercer and finish what she started, or does she stay and fight the fire, saving what little she has left? Either way, she knows one thing: this war isn't over yet. The fire raged behind her, consuming everything she and John had built. The wooden beams cracked and collapsed in a storm of embers, the heat pressing against her back as if trying to pull her in. The house was gone. But Martha Callahan was still standing. She didn't stay to watch it burn. There was something else that needed finishing. Her breath came in steady pulls as she followed the trail of blood leading away from the ranch, her burned hands gripping John's rifle like a lifeline. Every step was agony, every breath sharp with the sting of smoke, but she kept moving. Mercer was out there, wounded, running out of time. And she wasn't about to let him slip away. The land stretched out before her, empty and endless, bathed in the cold glow of the moon. Then, finally, she saw him. Slumped against a fallen tree, his body failing him at last. He was breathing hard, his shirt soaked with blood, one hand pressed weakly against his side. His gun lay inches away, useless now. For the first time, Elias Mercer looked human. Not a legend, not a ghost from her past. Just a dying man. Martha raised the rifle, the weight of it familiar, comforting. One shot would end it. One shot would bury this chapter of her life forever. Mercer chuckled, his voice raw, his breath uneven. Go on, then. Do it. His smirk was there, but his eyes weren't laughing. There was no defiance left, no malice. Only understanding. He knew he had lost. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Every instinct screamed for justice, for revenge. But killing him wouldn't bring John back. It wouldn't unburn her home. And worst of all, it would make her like him. Martha exhaled, her decision made. You don't get an easy way out, she said coldly. Then, without hesitation, she swung the rifle butt into his skull. The sound of bone cracking echoed through the empty plains. Mercer's body went limp, collapsing into the dirt, blood seeping into the earth beneath him. She had taken everything from him now. His power, his men, his legend. She turned without another word. She didn't need to watch him die. Death was too good for him. By the time the sun rose, she was already gone. The ashes of her home smoldered for days, the land blackened and scarred. But the people of Harper's Junction came, bringing wood, supplies, and quiet understanding. Because Martha Callahan wasn't just a widow anymore. She was something more. A survivor. Somewhere out there, Elias Mercer still breathed. But he wouldn't come back. Not after facing a woman who refused to break. She had won. And that was enough.